Hi guys, Mr. Hal here, and this is our final lesson for Unit 5, so it is 5E. And this one sort of seems like it's coming out of left field, but obviously I have reasons for putting it here, and it's just as important as anything else that we do, but like I said, it doesn't seem to really fit with everything that we've been doing. And yet, everything we've been doing really all contributes to the same concepts, which are rhetoric, of course. This is, a class largely about rhetoric. But we haven't talked about some of those nitty-gritty details of things that only pop up when we're talking about visual rhetoric. And so that's something that we're going to be taking a look at today, and I'll breeze through this with you guys, make sure you got some familiarity with that. And the thing to keep in mind is, and this is specifically, coming from my mind as an English teacher and my perspective, everything is the same as far as I'm concerned. And I think you'll find a lot of English scholars who would believe the same thing. And what I mean by that is, it doesn't matter whether it's a book. It doesn't matter whether it's an essay. It doesn't matter whether it's a song. It doesn't matter whether it's an advertisement. It doesn't matter whether it's a movie or a TV show or a YouTube video. None of that matters. It's all potentially rhetoric. And so, a lot of the things that we've been talking about thus far are just as applicable to written rhetoric, spoken rhetoric, as they are to visual rhetoric. It's just a matter of making sure that we have the lexicon at our disposal to differentiate between them and to look at some of those key things that maybe are situations that pop up in some categories but not in others. Hence, we come to decoding visual rhetoric, okay? Looking specifically at how imagery might be a little bit more unique in its presentation of rhetorical ideas, okay? So the first thing I want to present to you here, as we see, is your first impression questions. So particularly if you're somebody who has the tendency to be a little bit, who stumbles a little bit when you're looking at the visual things and isn't necessarily clear of, okay, I mean, this is just an ad for a car. What do I do now? Okay? If that's you, if that's how you think, well, some things to ponder. And really, these questions shouldn't come as too much of a surprise to you because they're pretty much questions that link back to the rhetorical situation. So just like anything else that we do in here, if you're trying to analyze rhetoric in any fashion, we'll find out the rhetorical situation. Okay, remember, camp so. That's what you should be doing in that case. So these very much do something similar. What is being said? What's the argument? What's the commentary that the ad is making? Who is saying it? So, and again, this might not necessarily be an ad. Who's doing the communication here? Where is this visual rhetoric coming from? What is that source? And who is the intended audience? Are you the intended audience? I mean, certainly you're the intended audience if I tell you that you need to look at it in class, but that doesn't mean you were the intended audience of the original creator of whatever that visual rhetoric happens to be. Why is it being said? Again, purpose. How are they trying to change you, make your life better, make the world better, whatever the case may be? And then how is it being said? Okay, getting into concepts of style and organization, even among images and how they function. So these are some questions that you should start thinking about if you're struggling to really decode how visual rhetoric works, okay? Now, again, why do I put this here? Well, I put this here because you could be making your own visual rhetoric at the same time, okay? These are tools that you could be using just like the previous modes of development are tools that you can be using when you're making your own rhetoric. These are the same tools that you could be using if you're making visual rhetoric, and some of you are making visual rhetoric. Certainly, I'm sure that some of you have to do projects in this class or other classes that have visuals associated with them. Surely, you're trying to convince people with images in some fashion, okay? And so this is just as much argumentation as those modes of development we've been looking at in the recent past, okay? Now, of course, I said identifying the rhetorical situation. That also means, let's bring it back up again, that rhetorical triangle. Okay, remember the triangle that connects the author and the audience to the subject and how seriously considers how they relate to each other on all three sides of that triangle, making sure that one satisfies the other, which satisfies the other, which satisfies the other, so on and so forth. So that's no less important in a visual text than it is a written text. In addition to the fact that you're going to find the same kind of rhetorical appeals, just that as you would in any kind of written or spoken text. Ethos, logos, pathos. Sometimes pathos is a little bit more intensified in this case because they're trying to do a lot with very minimal language. But ethos, logos, and pathos are just as much concerns when you're looking at something visual without a single word on it as if it had loads of words on it, if it was a full-blown book or something along those lines, okay? Now, we also need to make sure that we have, and this is what I was referring to before, the lexicon to talk about those visual components. Because unless you've taken a class on potentially advertising, or maybe an art class would touch on some of these things, sometimes we don't have the language to actually describe and discuss these visual components in an accurate, adequate way. And just as a little reminder, you will have visual rhetoric to observe and take a look at on the AP Lang test. So these are things that you want to get in the habit of making sure that you familiarize yourself with, just like anything else, okay? So let's start with this, okay? Composition is the physical arrangement of objects and characters within the frame of an image, okay? So you're specifically thinking about it from that frame itself and where things are and where they're related to one another and how big and how close and all of that other stuff. How is it composed? How is it organized in that fashion? Okay. Now, that is, in a lot of cases, very similar to this concept of framing, the presentation of visual elements in an image, especially the placement of the focal point of an image in relation to other visual aspects of that image. So, framing takes composition a little bit like a step further and starts to say, okay, why is this the focal point? Why is that person standing to the right of that person, but that person to the left of that person? You're starting to get into justifying the composition to a greater degree and looking at those individual elements and saying, okay, what's the significance of that? Okay. The background is the part of an image that is behind the objects depicted in the foreground. Okay, that hopefully should make a great deal of sense, just like the foreground should make sense. The part of an image that is nearest to the viewer. And one of the things that I sort of feel compelled to talk about, just because it's something that I do extensively discuss with my students in my film studies class, is you need to keep in mind those definitions are very malleable, okay? Sometimes a concept or an idea or an image in this case can be backgrounded, and yet it still is super large because the focal point is directing you away from that. So, yes, it is, foreground is usually close to you, background is usually far away from you, but you don't want to think too rigidly on that, in that manner because, like I said, sometimes the focal point is from a composition perspective, maybe from a purely technical perspective, sort of misleading you away from thinking that the background is in the back and the foreground is in the front, okay? Think about things like lines. Are there any lines? A path traced by a moving point in an image, either real or implied, creating a sense of borders, direction, and or motion to the viewer. For case in point, I mean, think about how many car advertisements have the motion blur coming out the back of the car or something like that to give it that sort of indication of speed. But any kind of line, path, you can also be thinking about, you know, where your eye movement goes. What kind of path and line does it seem to follow? Could also just be the line of, you know, there could be literal lines, actual lines printed on the page that you're sort of tracing the direction of as well, okay? The one that we have lots of subcategories, as you can see down here, is color, okay? And as you can see with that, we're talking about hue, value, tint, and intensity. Okay, now who knew that there were that many options under color? Well, I'm sure the art teachers did, but not necessarily me. Okay, so what are we talking about with all of these different things regarding color? Well, what is the hue? The hue is just the name of the color. Okay, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, yada, yada, yada. That's the hue, okay? Value is then going to be the lightness or darkness of it. Okay, so if you make it a very dark orange as opposed to a very light orange, that's going to be the value of it. The tint then is going to be the hue plus any additional lightness created by adding white. So it's increasing the quantity of white that you would mix into orange paint or something in that case. Whereas shade, right below it, that's the hue plus any additional darkness created by adding black. Okay, so specifically putting black in there as well. Okay, and then lastly, sort of intensity, the purity of a color to represent its defined hue. So, as you know, there's a limitless number of different colors of green, well, is this like the rainbow official version if you got a Crayola pack of 8 crayons version of green? Or is it some other variety of green, and therefore it's an alternative intensity, okay? So lots of different words for color, all of them relevant, all of them worth pointing out and mentioning when you're doing any kind of rhetorical analysis or when you're arguing your own rhetoric through visuals, okay? And then we come down to the last two. We've got focus. So I've used this word focus a couple of times. We need to talk about what that means. So it says the point in an image to which the viewer's eye is immediately drawn. So generally we conceive of that as being the thing that isn't the foreground or the background. It's the thing that is in between the foreground and the background. Kind of what I was trying to explain to you guys previously. So it's where your eye is drawn. It may also, as you know, because, I mean, you guys have lived on Earth for 17, 18 years at this point. You also know it sometimes refers to the level of clarity in an image. So if it's out of focus or in focus, you know, the fuzziness or the lack of fuzziness as it has a tendency to be. Used, for example, in it, what is it, like an allergy medicine where all of the pictures of the people who have allergy problems, all of their heads are out of focus to show you that they haven't taken this allergy medicine yet. You may have seen those ads, okay? So elements in high focus are going to be clear and distinct with defined edges, no blurriness or fuzziness. And then elements in low focus are going to be blurred and indefinite, okay? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about focus. And lastly, we're just talking about shape. You know what shapes are, okay? You knew that from elementary school geometry, okay? Which wasn't even called geometry, I guess, probably. So a two-dimensional form that occupies an area with identifiable boundaries created by a line or outline, a shift in texture, or a shift in color. Can you describe the things that you're seeing in visual rhetoric as triangles, squares, trapezoids, octagons, whatever the case may be? Is there some defined shape you can use? And asking yourself, is there any symbolism? Isn't there any interpretation or interpretive value to those kinds of shapes? Because sometimes there is. And really, that sort of ties me back into everything we just talked about right there. Asking yourselves, well, what is the rhetorical value of those things? Okay? Framing one thing next to another thing. What is the rhetorical value of that? Having one thing in the background but a different thing in the foreground. What's the rhetorical value of that? Okay? Tracing the line that something makes within the image. What's the rhetorical value of that? Yes, hue, value, tint, shade, intensity. Describing any single color with all 5 of those terms in a piece of visual rhetoric might be necessary because you need to answer the question, well, they choose this color, including hue, value, tint, shade, and intensity, specifically because it accomplishes this goal, has this logical or pathetic value to it, something along those lines. So remember, that's why we introduce all of this stuff, both so that you can use it and think critically about how you want to use these visuals within your rhetorical text, but also so you can start to ask the questions, okay, I know this thing is in the foreground. Why is it in the foreground? Whenever you're doing rhetorical analyses as well. So, as always, come to class with any questions or concerns you may happen to have. Otherwise, hopefully that made some sense. And particularly for you artistic-minded individuals out there, you can see what I'm talking about with relative ease. But nonetheless, I will see you guys shortly, and thank you for joining me.